Cash Johnny Cane's The Minutiae, starring Vaughn Coovey. Episode 3, Wyoming State Representative.
Chapter 3, Vaughn Coovey, Wyoming State Representative, House District 28, Cheyenne, Wyoming. On his very first day sitting as a voting member of the House Agriculture, State and Public Lands and Water Resources Committee, the job he thought he had signed up for arrived wearing teeth and claws. The committee room on the east side of the Capitol hummed with the low, practiced noise of government, staff shuffling papers, the faint buzz of overhead lights, the soft clack of laptops. Vaughn sat at his new spot along the dais with the little brass plate reading Coovey, HD 28, freshly screwed into the wood. His notebook was already open, pen placed neatly along the spiral. His committee assignment to House Agriculture had not been an accident. During orientation, he had quietly asked leadership to place him where land, water, and wildlife collided. He had made the case that representing Washakie County, with its mix of ranch ground, river, and the shadow of the Bighorns, gave him every reason to care about how the state managed what walked, grazed, and hunted there. When the Speaker later confirmed his appointment to the committee, he had felt genuine gratitude edged with healthy fear. It was exactly where he wanted to be, but he knew it would also be where the hard fights lived. That morning, the agenda looked typical of an interim workday. Water project updates, grazing lease renewals, and a briefing from the Department of Agriculture. Then, Committee Chair Momliero, wearing his committee hat, turned a page in his packet, adjusted his glasses, and announced the next topic: the grizzly bears of the Bighorn Front. He summarized, in his even courtroom-steady cadence, the reports that had been filtering in from Manderson, Hyattville, and neighboring ranch country. Ranchers were calling the Wyoming Game and Fish Department with complaints of calves disappearing at a rate they hadn't seen before. Fence lines had been torn open near river bottoms and unfamiliar tracks in places that had never carried them. A few ranchers had started sending in photographs of what they were seeing at dawn light along creeks and irrigation ditches. Broad, clawed paw prints pressed into wet sand and mud, bigger than anything black bears were leaving. The committee had been given copies of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department's annual large carnivore report in advance. Vaughn had already read his twice. The conclusions were unambiguous. Collar data, verified sightings, and depredation investigations all pointed in the same direction. Grizzly bears, once a distant issue for the greater Yellowstone Corps, were now pushing into country along the Bighorn Mountains in numbers the report described as unprecedented. The report described corridors being tested and expanded, boars exploring new ranges, and sporadic conflicts blossoming into patterns. It highlighted the Bighorn Front as an emerging front line in the slow geographic expansion of a species still carrying federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. Mom listened to the murmurs ripple through the hearing room, then, with the practiced calm of a chair who had seen plenty of storms, formally directed Committee Clerk Maylin Pei to add Bighorn Grizzly Management to the interim study docket for the year. That simple act, placing the issue onto the official list of topics the committee was obliged to study, changed everything. From that moment, grizzlies along the Bighorn Front were no longer just a set of alarming field notes and photos. They were a problem of state concern, assigned to a committee that now owned it. Vaughn felt a small, secret thrill under the weight of the responsibility. This was exactly the terrain he had hoped to walk as a legislator, where wildlife, ranching, law, and long-term stewardship met. And yet, beneath the excitement, there was a steadying reminder. He was new here. He had more questions than answers. If he was going to touch grizzly management, he would need more than intuition and sympathy. He would need a record so solid that it could hold under the weight of an angry room and, if it came to it, an angry court. The grizzlies had found him. The question now was what he was going to do with them. When the committee recessed for lunch, most of his colleagues drifted toward the cafeteria or out into the February light of Capitol Avenue. Vaughn turned in the opposite direction. The Legislative Service Office sat across the way in a less grand building, the place where the machinery behind every bill, resolution, and interim memo lived. He had already learned that if the House floor was where the speeches happened, the LSO was where the work did. He stepped into the reception area, nodded to the front desk staff, and asked to see Marshall Truitt, the policy analyst assigned to the Agriculture and Natural Resources beat. Marshall's office door was half open, the interior crowded with binders labeled with years, topics, and committee acronyms. A map of Wyoming covered one wall, pocked with colored pins. Vaughn did not pretend to know what he needed in technical terms. He instead approached it the way he knew best, by describing the picture he wanted to see. He wanted every depredation record tied to grizzly conflicts on the Bighorn front that game and fish could legally share. Reports, GPS coordinates, photos, field notes, investigator summaries, maps. He also wanted 18 months of compensation data for cattle losses attributed to grizzlies in that region, including dates, amounts, and types of livestock. He wanted to see when checks had been cut, for what amounts, and for what kinds of losses. Marshall listened, then translated the request into the language of forms and data pulls. He drafted a formal information request to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, copying the committee chair and counsel. He noted that certain elements, especially anything containing personally identifiable information about landowners, would need to be redacted or summarized. He tapped a finger on his keyboard as he cross-referenced an internal list of standing data agreements between the LSO and various agencies. Within days, the information began to arrive, routed first to Marshall's inbox, then into a draft briefing binder with dividers and color-coded tabs. Depredation reports came in as scanned forms, each documenting a complaint from a rancher, date, location, livestock affected, and evidence observed. Some included investigator comments about the presence of tracks, scat, hair, or carcass condition. Others attached photos, grainy but telling, of mauled calves and unmistakable tracks in mud. The compensation data came in as a spreadsheet exported from Game and Fish's reimbursement system. It listed each claim, the type of livestock lost, the number of head, and the compensation amount paid. Over an 18-month window, the numbers added up. $94,600 paid out to ranchers for calf losses linked to confirmed or probable grizzly depredations. When Marshall handed over the completed binder, he also handed Vaughn a short, explanatory memo, a summary of how the data had been obtained, which statutes governed its use, and what caveats attached. It was the kind of memo a court might later look at if anyone ever questioned whether the committee had done its homework. Back in his small legislative office, Vaughn opened the binder and began working through it page by page. He tried not to focus only on the dollar total, as alarming as it was for a region with narrow margins. The money was important, but he suspected that the pattern underneath would matter even more. He plotted the incidents on a map using the GPS coordinates and township descriptions, marking each new depredation with a small dot. The dots formed clusters along particular drainages, around certain calving pastures, and near predictable pinch points where bears would naturally travel. The account descriptions told a story of ranchers who had tried night patrols, range riders, noisemakers, and hasty electric fencing, often improvising with the materials they had on hand. He saw the same names repeated in the forms, ranch families he knew from his 10 sleep days, and made note of how many times they had called for help and how long it had taken for that help to arrive. The numbers, he decided, were not just big, they were structured. And if the state was going to ask anyone, ranchers, conservationists, agencies, to accept a new plan, it would have to rest on facts everyone could see and touch. He closed the binder only when his notes were thick and messy, then turned to the next question his mind insisted on raising. Who else needed to be in the room before any policy was drafted? From the quiet of his car parked along Cary Avenue, he called Committee Chair Maum Liero. He laid out what he had just seen in the depredation binder, emphasizing that the reports were not mere rumor. They were verified incidents backed by the Game and Fish Department's own investigations and compensation checks. He suggested that before the committee let anyone in Cheyenne argue theory, it should go to the people whose calves, fences, and sleep were being eaten first. Maum, who had spent his career balancing roomfuls of competing interests, agreed that a field hearing was the right next step. As chair, he had the authority to direct Committee Clerk Mei Lin Pei to schedule one as part of the interim work plan. Within days, Mei Lin drafted a notice for an official interim field hearing of the House Agriculture, State and Public Lands and Water Resources Committee to be held at the Washakie County Courthouse in Worland. The notice specified date, time, and purpose to receive testimony regarding emerging grizzly bear conflicts along the Bighorn Front. Under Wyoming's open meetings and notice laws, the hearing had to be advertised in local newspapers and on the legislature's website. Mei Lin coordinated with the Washakie County Clerk's office to reserve the commissioner's hearing room, arrange for a court reporter or digital recording equipment, and ensure there would be enough seating and sound amplification. Committee staff prepared a packet for members, a condensed version of the depredation data, a map showing the general area of concern, and a brief explanation of the federal status of grizzly bears. They also drafted an agenda that structured the testimony into panels: ranchers, state agencies, conservation organizations, and local governments. 3 weeks later, committee members from around the state checked into modest motels around Worland, their travel reimbursement forms tucked into their briefcases. Shafts of late winter sun lit the courthouse portico as staff carried in boxes of paper cups, coffee urns, and sign-in sheets. The state had officially arrived to listen. By the time the hearing gavelled in, the Washakie County Commissioner's room was already full. Ranchers in denim and dust-worn boots sat shoulder to shoulder in the front rows. Representatives from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department occupied a cluster of seats near the aisle, their agency patches visible on pressed shirts. Conservation groups, easily identifiable by their logo fleece and bulging backpacks, claimed a section nearby. A selection of county commissioners sat along the wall, flanked by a pair of sheriff's deputies keeping an unobtrusive watch. Local tourism and outfitting business owners filled in the gaps, their livelihoods tied to both healthy wildlife and stable ranch communities. The rest of the room was a mix of townspeople who had come because they had heard the word grizzly and wanted to see what their government would do about it. Committee staff set up a witness table facing the dais. A portable recorder blinked red as it captured everything for the permanent record. A stack of speaker cards sat at the front, ready for anyone who wished to testify. After the chair opened the hearing and outlined the purpose, protocol, and time limits, he turned the floor over to Vaughn. This was his show. Vaughn began with what he privately thought of as the baseline phase. He called forward the ranching panel and, rather than inviting immediate free-form speeches, led them through a series of structured questions. He asked how many depredation incidents each had reported in the last 2 years, what sort of non-lethal measures they had tried before calling game and fish, how long it had taken for agency staff to respond, and what the outcomes had been. He wanted the answers in the transcript in their own words, even if he already knew them from the binder on his desk. It mattered that the record showed both their grievances and their efforts at restraint. Maisie Dunn, speaking for the ranching group, answered on behalf of several operations along the Bighorn Front. As she described calf losses, torn fences, and the unease of sending children out before daylight in calving season, Vaughn kept one eye on his spreadsheet. The figures she mentioned, numbers of calves lost, dates of incidents, matched what he had obtained from the LSO and game and fish records, often down to units and timing. This alignment reassured him. It meant the data and the lived experience were telling the same story. Her testimony also revealed details that no report could fully capture. She described the improvisational nature of rancher-led deterrence. Floodlights, runoff generators, homemade noise devices, temporary electric fencing strung with whatever could be bolted together between long days in the saddle. She made clear that most of the ranchers in the room were not asking to be handed a rifle and told to solve the problem themselves. They were asking for help that fit within the law and for a state recognition that doing nothing would eventually make everyone's life harder, bears included. When the ranchers finished, Vaughn shifted the focus to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department's table. Esker Jensen, the department's carnivore supervisor, spoke for the state. He confirmed the trend lines already visible in the large carnivore report. More confirmed grizzly sign along the bighorn front, more complaints, more verified depredations. He described the department's efforts to monitor bear movements through collars and remote cameras, and the limited number of staff who could be dispatched for hazing, trapping, and relocation. Esker acknowledged, with the frankness of someone used to operating under constraints, that funding and staffing had not kept pace with the emerging frontier. Response times were longer than ideal. Carcasses remained on the landscape longer than was wise, and hazing and relocation efforts were often triaged toward the highest profile conflicts near park boundaries, leaving new fronts like the Bighorns relying more on improvisation and patience than on robust, proactive management. Vaughn listened, taking note of every place where effort was described, but capacity was not. Then it was the conservationists' turn. The panel included representatives from groups that had long pushed for grizzly recovery and habitat protection. Their lead voice that day was Balthazar Otay of Wyoming Wildlife Advocates. Where much of the room had focused on calves and pasture, Balthazar widened the camera. He framed the grizzly expansion into bighorn country not as a simple success story of a growing population, but as a symptom of ecological change. He pointed to whitebark pine decline in the core range, prolonged drought affecting lower elevation food sources, and shifting elk migration patterns. Bears, in his view, were not pushing eastward purely because they were thriving. They were also being pushed by the quiet collapse or rearrangement of pieces of their native puzzle. He reminded the committee that grizzlies remained listed as a threatened species under federal law. Whatever Wyoming did, it would have to be done in a way that could be defended under the Endangered Species Act. Any state-sanctioned lethal responses outside very clear exceptions would draw the attention of federal agencies and courts. He urged the committee to think in terms of coexistence strategies and non-lethal tools, not expanded kill authority. Vaughn appreciated the way Balthazar's remarks surfaced the legal boundary lines alongside the ecological ones. The hearing was not just about barbed wire and paw prints. It was also about federal statutes and litigation risk. After the final panel spoke and a handful of individual citizens added their comments, the chair closed the testimony. He reminded everyone that the session had been convened as a fact-finding exercise. No policy was being adopted that day. The record would be transcribed, and the LSO would compile a summary of testimony to inform whatever came next. As people filtered out, ranchers lingering in the hallway to talk with game and fish staff, advocates gathering in small knots to compare notes, Vaughn stayed behind. He helped staff clear paper coffee cups and gather leftover agendas, his hands working on autopilot while his mind replayed the afternoon. He had heard in person the same conflict lines he had seen on paper. Now he needed to turn that noise into a framework that might actually work. The next morning, the air in Cheyenne carried the dry chill of early spring. Vaughn walked a block off the main drag to a small coffee shop on West 17th Street, a quiet place tucked behind the more formal government buildings. It was the kind of spot where staffers ducked in with laptops and where senior legislators occasionally met when they wanted to talk without microphones. He had asked committee chair Mamliero to join him there. He needed an honest debrief, both on how he had handled the Whirland hearing and on what came next. He knew how to run county meetings and build local ordinances. He did not yet know how to turn a statewide wildlife conflict into a durable state statute. They took a corner table and Vaughn set his legal pad between them, pen aligned along the margin. He might have been older than some first-term representatives, but in that moment, he felt every bit the eager student. Mom, who had seen dozens of new lawmakers arrive and either flourish or flounder, did not waste time on flattery, but did not skimp on credit either. He gave Vaughn a carefully structured assessment of the Whirland hearing. The new representative had kept the room orderly, kept testimony focused, and treated every panel with the same level of seriousness. He had asked questions that built a clear, coherent record without inflaming the underlying tensions. For a first field hearing as a legislator, it had gone better than many. Then Mom shifted to the part Vaughn cared about most, procedure. He explained that if they wanted to move beyond hearings and into actual policy, They could not afford to build on hunches or anecdotes. They needed a foundation that the LSO could rely on when drafting, and that foundation had to reflect more than just who spoke the loudest. He laid out a simple but rigorous prescription. First, the committee would need a set of written position papers representing the primary vantage points: ranchers, state wildlife management, conservation advocates, and the federal agency charged with grizzly oversight. Each paper would need to outline the organization's view of the emerging Bighorn Front issue, describe existing tools and their limitations, and submit any formal recommendations and red lines. Second, those papers would be assembled into a single committee packet alongside the depredation data, compensation numbers, and the transcript summary from the field hearing. Only when that packet was complete and on file could they legitimately ask LSO counsel to begin drafting a bill. Third, because any state statute touching grizzly management would intersect with federal listings and management plans, they needed to anticipate mandatory coordination with the Attorney General's office and with federal agencies. That would mean planning for a federal consistency review under the Endangered Species Act and building clear statements of legislative intent into the bill's structure. As Mom worked through the steps, Vaughn kept writing, the soft scratch of his pen never quite stopping. One by one, he began pairing names with the bullet points on the page. Letty Precy from the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, Dr. Ari Valence-Bajetz, a senior game and fish biologist with deep experience in large carnivores. Nehemiah Crabtree of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, carrying the conservation case in both science and advocacy. And Marnie Munkavu, the region's grizzly lead for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If the foundation was going to be credible, each of them would need to put their position in writing. Finally, Mom leaned into the political reality. Any bill touching grizzly management would ignite passions. The goal, he observed, was not to produce a policy that made everyone happy. That was impossible. The goal was to produce one balanced enough that no core constituency felt betrayed and angry enough to try to kill it outright. He outlined the beginnings of what he called a coexistence framework, a pilot program focused on non-lethal tools, a dedicated carnivore specialist stationed where the conflicts were actually occurring, a clear and enforceable response window for depredation investigations, robust public data reporting to keep everyone honest, and a sunset clause to reassure skeptics that the program could be reevaluated in a few years rather than written into stone. Then he turned to the quieter, more delicate part of the job, vote counting. If the bill ever made it out of committee, it would need to survive the House floor. That meant building, carefully and mostly out of sight, a coalition of members who understood what the bill attempted and were willing to own it with him. Mom mentioned two specific colleagues, Mary Beth Carey and Louette Fesperman, as likely allies who could be brought across from cautious neutrality into active support if they saw that both ranchers and conservationists had been genuinely heard. By the time the coffee had cooled in their cups, Vaughn's legal pad held what amounted to a road map: gather the universe of perspectives, package it properly, deliver it to council, and begin quietly to line up votes. He left the table with his mind buzzing, feeling for the first time that he could see the path from concerned testimony to actual statute, and that he would need every ounce of his humility and hunger for detail to walk it correctly. The work of the next 3 months looked less like rhetoric and more like logistics. Vaughn started with the rancher's perspective. Using his legislative email and the official letterhead of House District 28, he drafted a formal request to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, addressed to its representative on large carnivore issues, Letty Precy. He outlined the committee's interest in developing an interim recommendation regarding grizzly conflicts along the Bighorn Front and requested a written position paper that would be included in the public record. He followed the letter with a phone call, not to pressure, but to explain that he wanted the paper to speak in the association's own terms. He asked that it cover the scope of the problem as ranchers saw it, the tools they currently use to minimize depredations, the gaps they experienced in support from state and federal agencies, and any specific policy recommendations or red lines. Within a week, the association sent back a crisp, multi-page document by email. The paper laid out ranchers' economic realities and described in sober detail the rising costs of calf losses and fence damage. It cataloged non-lethal measures they had employed and their mixed effectiveness. It expressed deep concern about the potential for expanded grizzly presence to push some operations toward insolvency if the state did not step up with practical support. It warned against any statutory change that would further constrain ranchers' ability to protect their livestock within existing law. Next came the state wildlife perspective. Vaughn worked with Game and Fish to identify the right author for a technical paper, which led to Dr. Ari Valance-Bajetz, a senior biologist with expertise in large carnivores and habitat dynamics. His formal request mirrored the one sent to ranchers, but asked additionally for data-driven context. Current and projected grizzly populations in the relevant ecological regions, known movement corridors, success and failure rates of various non-lethal measures, and how existing agency resources aligned with emerging conflict fronts like the Bighorns. Dr. Valance-Bajetz responded quickly as well, emailing a document that combined narrative explanation with charts and citations. It described how grizzlies moved through landscapes, how food availability shaped those movements, and how conflict hotspots could be predicted and mitigated. It also described the limitations of current staffing and funding, noting that while core areas were relatively well covered, new frontiers like the Bighorns were not. The conservationist paper took longer. Vaughn reached out to the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and specifically to Nehemiah Crabtree, who had a reputation in the community as someone who could speak science to advocates and advocates to policymakers. His letter asked for a perspective on the ecological drivers behind grizzly expansion along the Bighorn Front, the coalition's position on non-lethal versus lethal management tools in that context, and any specific suggestions or concerns regarding a potential state-level pilot program. About a month later, a thick packet arrived by registered mail at the legislature, bearing the coalition's letterhead and Nehemiah's signature. The document blended ecological analysis with policy recommendations. It underscored the role of changing climate and food sources in pushing grizzlies into new ranges, argued strongly that any management plan must prioritize non-lethal methods and connectivity, and stated clearly that the coalition would oppose any statutory changes perceived as backdoor attempts to broaden lethal authority. It also offered a surprising degree of openness to a pilot program built around coexistence, provided it contained rigorous reporting requirements and a sunset clause tied to evaluation metrics. The federal perspective, however, proved harder to pin down. Vaughn's office had difficulty connecting directly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's grizzly lead for the region, Marnie Munkavu. Messages left with the regional office went unanswered at first. Emails bounced between staffers. Eventually, a brief voicemail made it through to his phone. Marnie apologized for her silence, explaining that she had been in the field for nearly 2 weeks, working with a multi-agency team on den monitoring and a relocation assessment for a sow with cubs in a remote corner of the Bighorn backcountry. Cell coverage had been spotty at best. She promised to prepare the requested written comments, but noted that it might take time to return to an office and assemble them properly. Vaughn did not want her perspective to be the missing leg of the table. He responded by offering to meet her nearer to where she was working. If she could arrange a time and place, he would gladly drive out to pick up whatever she could pull together, and if she was willing, observe a bit of the work she was doing in the field. She agreed. The next morning, he signed out a state pool vehicle and drove northwest out of Worland, the Bighorn Range growing from a distant blue line into an articulated spine of ridges and snow-streaked bowls. He left pavement for graded gravel, then gravel for a narrower 2-track road weaving through sage and scattered juniper. A set of GPS coordinates took him to a makeshift telemetry site on a ridge overlooking a willow-choked drainage. The setup was not glamorous. A temporary antenna mast braced against the wind, a folding table crowded with receivers, maps, and notebooks. Coal thistlewood, Inez escamilla, Mica yellowtail, and Taran ochii formed a small team of biologists and technicians in field gear, their faces weathered by a job that required both patience and tolerance for cold. Vaughn watched as they listened for signal pings from collared bears. adjusting knobs and cross-referencing the faint beeps against topography. They logged readings, checked batteries, and relayed updates to a separate team on foot. Samples were sifted, scat analyzed, and tracks photographed. It was painstaking work, the opposite of the dramatic images of helicopters and tranquilizer darts that most people imagined when they thought of bear management. Marnie handed him a thick packet of written comments secured with a rubber band. Her paper laid out the federal position, the legal framework governing grizzlies under the Endangered Species Act, existing recovery goals, and the parameters within which any state pilot program would need to operate in order to avoid conflict with federal mandates. It emphasized the importance of non-lethal tools and clear data collection, and it expressed cautious interest in collaborating on a pilot that improved coexistence rather than undermining protections. As they spoke about the packet and the pilot concept, she mentioned, almost in passing, that a contact of hers at the Department of the Interior in Washington had noted Vaughn's name in a recent conversation. The remark had been that he was making himself just noticeable enough to be interesting, perhaps even dangerous in the productive sense. Vaughn absorbed the comment with a mix of amusement and discomfort. He was still in his first year as a state representative. The idea that anyone in a federal building thousands of miles away even knew his name felt disproportionate to his own sense of stature. He chalked it up to the way the modern information ecosystem worked. Word traveled faster than it used to. Still, as he drove back down the mountain that afternoon, the thought of D.C. lodged itself in a corner of his mind he could not entirely clear. Weeks earlier, before the position papers had started to land, Vaughn had paid a courtesy visit to the man who would eventually translate all of this into law, Ori Weintraut, senior staff attorney at the Legislative Service Office. The LSO's legal wing occupied a quieter floor, the corridor lined with bookshelves containing state statutes, session laws, and volumes of case reporters. Ori's office was neat, not in the sterile sense, but in the way of someone who believed that order on the desk contributed to clarity and thought. Draft bills, neatly clipped, sat in stacked trays. A single fountain pen lay centered on a yellow pad. Vaughn opened by introducing himself and making it clear he wasn't there for immediate drafting help, but to show he intended to do things properly from the start. He explained that a grizzly bill would be coming eventually, and he wanted to know in advance how to best prepare for it. Ori responded with the professional patience of someone who had shepherded many legislators, new and seasoned, through the process. He described the LSO's role: neutral drafters working at the direction of legislators, responsible for translating policy goals into enforceable, coherent statutory language. He explained that for an issue as complex and potentially contentious as grizzly management, the LSO would insist on a complete record before putting pen to paper. He laid out, in his own way, a checklist that looked very much like the one Mom later echoed: agency input, stakeholder submissions, data, and clarity about the desired structure of any program. He also flagged the extra layer of scrutiny that would attach because the bill would necessarily intersect with federal law. Any draft would require, at minimum, consultation with the Attorney General's office to ensure that the statute did not conflict with the Endangered Species Act or expose the state to immediate litigation. Ori also described the importance of legislative intent language. Courts, he explained, often look to the structure and preambles of a statute to understand what the legislature had meant to do. If they wanted a coexistence pilot to be viewed as a good faith experiment rather than a disguised attempt to weaken protections, they would have to explicitly state this and incorporate it into funding mechanisms and evaluation requirements. He had walked Vaughn through a few examples of past complex bills, water compacts, wildlife management acts, that required coordination across jurisdictions. The lessons were simple, yet uncompromising. Build your foundation before drafting, anticipate your legal vulnerabilities, and be precise about who does what, when, and with whose money. As their meeting ended, he had distilled his advice into a single, memorable charge. He told Vaughn that if the representative brought him the complete universe of relevant facts and perspectives, he would help carve out the statute that fit inside it. Those words, half warning and half invitation, had stayed with Vaughn ever since. Now, with the last of the position papers stacked on his desk and the field hearing transcript summary in hand, Vaughn finally felt ready to bring that universe back upstairs. He spent an evening assembling the packet the way he had been trained as a county commissioner, organized, transparent, and easy to audit. He created a cover memo summarizing the purpose of the proposed bill and listing the attached exhibits. He inserted tabbed dividers labeled Ranchers, Game and Fish, Conservation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Depredation Data, Compensation Data, and Field Hearing Summary. He highlighted sections in each paper where the authors agreed on facts. The reality of increased grizzly presence along the Bighorn Front, the inadequacy of current non-lethal support for ranchers, the staffing and funding constraints facing game and fish, and the legal boundary lines drawn by the Endangered Species Act. He also flagged areas of tension, ranchers' concerns about lethal restrictions, advocates' fears of kill expansions, and federal cautions about consistency. When he was satisfied that the packet accurately reflected the landscape rather than his own preferences, he called Ori's office and scheduled a formal drafting conference. In procedural terms, it was a small step, just another entry on a busy attorney's calendar. To Vaughn, it felt like moving from reconnaissance to construction. 22 days after he delivered the packet, a call came from Ori's assistant. The draft was ready. The call had doubled as an invitation. Ori wanted Vaughn and committee chair Maum Liero in the room to walk through it. When Vaughn arrived at the LSO conference room, Maum was already there, leaning back in his chair with the air of someone both relaxed and coiled. On the table in front of Ori sat 3 identical binders with fresh cover sheets bearing the title Bighorn Grizzly Coexistence Pilot Act, 3-year program. Ori slid a binder to each of them, then opened his own and began what, to him, was routine, a guided tour through the architecture of a bill. The opening section set out findings and intent. It acknowledged the documented increase in grizzly bear presence along the Bighorn Front, the corresponding rise in verified livestock depredations, and the efforts of ranchers, state agencies, and conservation organizations alike to address the conflicts. It stated explicitly that the legislature intended to establish a time-limited pilot project aimed at improving coexistence between grizzlies and livestock operations through enhanced non-lethal management, improved response timelines, and transparent public reporting. The next section created the pilot program itself. It authorized the Department of Game and Fish to establish a Bighorn Grizzly Coexistence Unit, including 1 FTE carnivore specialist to be based out of Worland. That specialist's responsibilities were spelled out: coordinate depredation response in the Bighorn Front region, advise ranchers on non-lethal deterrence, oversee carcass removal where appropriate, and liaise with federal partners on relocation decisions. A funding section followed, appropriating a specified amount from a designated state account to a non-lethal toolbox grant fund. The fund would provide cost-sharing grants to ranchers for qualified non-lethal measures: electric fencing, fladry, range riders, guard animals, and other tools approved by the department. The statute required the department to develop application criteria, prioritize projects in high-conflict zones, and report annually on grants awarded, tools deployed, and outcomes observed. Another section set the response standard. In any case where a livestock depredation was reported in the pilot area, the department would be obligated to initiate an investigation within 72 hours, weather and safety permitting. The investigation timeline, findings, and any subsequent management action, hazing, relocation, lethal removal under existing authority, would need to be documented and added to a public report. The bill also mandated data transparency. The department would be required to publish, at least annually, a summary of depredation incidents, responses, and outcomes in the pilot region. The report would include numbers and locations of incidents by general area, without disclosing confidential landowner information, tools used, and whether the bear in question was relocated, hazed, or, in rare cases, lethally removed under existing federal and state rules. A key section addressed federal coordination. The act directed the department to enter into or amend a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that relocation and management decisions in the pilot area remained consistent with the Federal Recovery Plan and listing status. It also required the department to transmit its annual pilot reports to the service for review. Finally, the sunset clause set the act to expire 3 years after its effective date, unless renewed by the legislature. Before expiration, the department would be required to submit a comprehensive evaluation of the pilot's effectiveness, including metrics such as changes in depredation rates, changes in lethal removals, and stakeholder satisfaction. As Ori talked through each section, he occasionally paused to note where language had been chosen specifically to address likely legal challenges or political objections. The structure was tight, framed to reassure each major constituency that their core concerns had been considered without ceding control to any one of them. Vaughn followed along, underlining phrases and scribbling marginalia. He realized he was not just learning the content of this bill. He was absorbing how a good statute looked when built on a careful record. By the end of the walkthrough, 3 things were clear. First, the bill did not enlarge lethal authority. It leaned into non-lethal tools and shared responsibility. That would matter to conservationists and federal reviewers. Second, it offered ranchers something tangible: money for prevention, a dedicated specialist, and a codified response timeline that could be enforced politically, if not judicially. Third, it made the whole experiment revisitable. If the pilot failed, it would die. If it worked, future legislatures could use its structure as a template. When they closed their binders, the room's energy shifted. The conceptual work was done. The procedural work was beginning. Ori's office would file the draft with the House clerk, where it would be assigned a bill number and formally introduced. Mom, as chair, would ensure it was scheduled for a hearing in the House Agriculture. Vaughn's task, from that point forward, would be to build and hold a coalition willing to vote for it. He left the meeting with the binder under his arm and the distinct sense that the grizzly issue had moved from fog into form. Paper was one thing. The people who would live with the consequences were another. Maisie Dunn's ranch lay where the Bighorn foothills softened into long tongues of pasture and sage. Cottonwoods marked a creek that threaded through the property. Old fence lines curled away toward blue-gray ridges in the distance. The place looked, on first impression, like any number of family operations in northern Wyoming. To Vaughn, it also looked like one of the first real test sites for the bill he now carried. He drove the state sedan up the gravel lane and parked alongside a row of dust-coated pickups. The ranch house kitchen offered strong coffee, clean mugs, and the faint, comforting smell of something baked earlier in the day. Maisie had invited 2 neighboring ranchers, Wesson Cree and Wyatt Cinderell, to join them. Their combined operations represented a significant strip of the Bighorn Front's working ground. Vaughn set 3 copies of the Bighorn Grizzly Coexistence Pilot Act on the table and outlined in plain procedural terms what the bill proposed to do. He described the non-lethal grant fund, the Whirland-based carnivore specialist, the 72-hour investigation requirement, the public reporting, and the 3-year sunset. They leafed through the bill line by line, occasionally stopping to ask Vaughn to explain how a particular section would play out in practice. Their questions clustered around predictable points. They wanted to know whether the 72-hour clock started when they called a local number or a central hotline, and who they would talk to in those first urgent hours after a depredation. They wanted to understand whether accepting grant money for a non-lethal fence would come with any strings attached regarding how they could manage problem animals under existing law. They asked what would happen if a bear returned again and again to a particular pasture, even after non-lethal measures had been tried and documented. Vaughn answered as directly as he could, always framing his responses in terms of the bill's text and the existing regulatory environment rather than speculation. The clock, he explained to himself as much as to them, would be tied to receipt of a formal report, but the bill could be interpreted to allow for immediate notification through established channels. The grants, as written, did not impose new restrictions on lethal defense of life or property beyond those already embedded in law. They were designed to add tools, not take them away. Repeat offenders, he knew, would be documented in the public reporting requirement, making it harder for agencies to ignore patterns and easier to justify more decisive action under existing federal and state frameworks. The ranchers' faces shifted as they thought through the implications. They recognized that they were being asked to participate in an experiment, one that would ask them to document and engage more deliberately with state and federal agencies than some were used to. But they also saw, perhaps for the first time, a state-backed plan that did more than tell them to live with the losses. By the time coffee had cooled and a chokecherry crumble had been cut, they had not become cheerleaders. Ranch people rarely did. But they had moved from suspicion toward conditional support. They signaled that if the bill stayed intact and the grant fund and specialist position were funded at meaningful levels, they would have no objection to their names being associated with a letter indicating cautious support. For Vaughn, the quiet nods across a kitchen table mattered as much as any statement entered into the committee record. Trust, in his experience, was earned as often between sips of coffee as it was between gavel strikes. The conservation side required a different kind of table. Vaughn asked Balthazar Ortai to meet him at the small cafe inside the Washakie Museum's Prairie Wind Interpretive Center. It seemed like neutral ground, exhibits on native wildlife outside the windows, maps of migration routes on the walls, children's drawings of birds and bears taped to corkboards. Balthazar arrived early and alone, his jacket draped over the back of his chair, notebooks stacked neatly beside his coffee. Years of advocacy had taught him where and how to sit in such meetings, visible but not ostentatious, prepared but not performative. Vaughn laid the pilot bill between them and guided him through it, this time emphasizing the parts he knew would matter most to a conservationist who had spent a career watching statutes used both to protect and to erode. He highlighted the non-lethal toolbox grant fund and the requirement that every depredation response be documented and reported publicly. He pointed out that the bill did not touch the legal boundaries around lethal control. It neither expanded nor contracted existing authority. He underscored the federal coordination section and the mandatory MOU with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He lingered on the sunset clause and evaluation requirements, noting that the pilot could be judged empirically after 3 years rather than becoming a permanent feature grabbed in a single political moment. Balthazar also read the bill closely. He traced the line where state dollars would flow to non-lethal measures rather than to litigation budgets. He noticed the absence of language that could be construed as an attempt at delisting by stealth. He saw that while the pilot gave ranchers the tools they had been asking for, it also required agencies to behave more consistently and transparently. Every relocation, every repeat depredation, every incremental success or failure would be documented, and those documents would be public. For someone who tended to treat terms like coexistence with suspicion, too often misused as cover for status quo practices, this structure felt different. It was not a rhetorical nod. It was a set of specific commitments attached to staff, money, timelines, and data. By the end of their discussion, Balthazar remained vigilant in his skepticism. That was his job, but he had moved into a pragmatic posture. He indicated that his organization could, at minimum, stand down from active opposition and might be willing, if certain implementation details were handled well, to express qualified support. He noted that monitoring and public reporting would allow his group to audit the pilot in real time and, if necessary, document any slippage for future debate. That was enough for Vaughn. In his experience, a bill with committed allies on one side and determined enemies on the other usually bled in the aisles. A bill that managed to keep both sides in wary, watchful cooperation had a chance to survive. On the drive back to Cheyenne, the highway unfurled in a long, familiar ribbon. The rhythm of the tires against the asphalt worked as a kind of moving office. He used the time to call Mom. He described the ranch kitchen and the museum cafe, the questions asked, the concerns aired, and the tentative commitments made. He emphasized that both ranchers and conservationists had not just agreed to be quiet, they had engaged with the specifics and seemed prepared to accept, even if grudgingly, the pilot's balance. Mom, in turn, shared how he had spent the interim weeks. He had approached Representatives Mary Beth Carey and Louette Fesperman, walking them through the same architecture he and Vaughn had just reviewed with the binder. Carey, with an agricultural constituency but a cautious temperament, had responded positively to the idea of securing non-lethal funding and codified response standards without touching lethal authority. Fesperman, more oriented toward conservation and tourism economies, had appreciated the transparency and sunset clause. Both, he reported, were now inclined to sign on as co-sponsors. Mom also mentioned a scheduled trip to Cody for his routine chair responsibilities, meeting with regional game and fish leadership, reviewing interagency briefing notes headed to the governor, and reinforcing the message that House Agriculture was paying attention to how carnivore management played out district by district. He promised that when he returned to Cheyenne, he would work with the LSO and clerk Maylin Pei to have the pilot bill formally introduced and placed on the committee's docket for hearing. Vaughn ended the call with a growing awareness that the project had shifted from a conceptual exercise to a moving object. He checked his speedometer and eased the sedan slightly back from where his adrenaline had pushed it. Back in the House chamber, the process of turning a draft into a live bill was almost ritualistic in its brevity. On the appointed day, House members took their seats at their desks, the daily calendar screens glowing with bill numbers and titles. The clerk read through introductions and referrals in order, a steady cadence of legislative language filling the hall. When the clerk reached the line detailing the Bighorn Grizzly Coexistence Pilot Act, Vaughn rose from desk 38. The movement was unadorned, the action scripted by House rules. He formally moved that the bill, now assigned a number in the hundreds, be introduced and referred to the House Agriculture, State and Public Lands and Water Resources Committee. Speaker Mom Liero, now wearing his other hat as presiding officer of the chamber, called for any objection. None came. No one rose to demand debate at the introduction stage. There was no floor speech, no applause, no theater. The motion was carried by silence and gavel. With that small sequence, the bill entered the machine. It was no longer merely a binder in an attorney's office or a packet on a committee staffer's desk. It had become House Bill 147, assigned to the committee best positioned to understand it and dispossess it. Once in committee, the bill's trajectory became a matter of scheduling and preparation. House Agriculture set a date for the hearing. Notices went out under the quiet efficiency of Clerk Maylin Pei, and the same classes of people who had gathered in Worland, ranchers, agency staff, conservationists, found their way to a different hearing room, this time under the Capitol Dome. The LSO prepared a summary of the bill and distributed copies to members. A fiscal note was attached outlining the projected cost of the pilot program and the source of the proposed appropriation. Vaughn, as bill's sponsor, opened the hearing with a concise explanation of the problem and the proposed solution, grounding his remarks in the field hearing record, the depredation data, and the multi-stakeholder position papers. He did not dramatize. He laid out the architecture, non-lethal funding, a Worland-based specialist, 72-hour depredation response, public reporting, federal coordination, and a 3-year sunset with evaluation. Witnesses followed. Ranch interests, including some of the same faces from Worland, reiterated their experiences and stressed the importance of practical tools and timely responses. Conservation representatives acknowledged their historic skepticism in similar debates, but described their cautious openness to this specific pilot, given its structure and transparency. The department's carnivore staff walked through the operational aspects, explaining how the specialist would be deployed, how grants would be administered, and how data would be tracked. Committee questions drilled into details. Representatives Mary Beth Carey and Louette Fesperman pressed on funding and staffing, while additional members like Katrin Applewhite, Diego Penhaligon, and Shyla Spotted Elk focused on response timelines, reporting requirements, and how the pilot would interact with tribal lands and neighboring jurisdictions. Members asked how many FTEs would be required, whether the 72-hour investigation timeline was realistic in the Bighorns during certain times of year, how the department would ensure that grant funds were used effectively, and whether the sunset clause was long enough to yield meaningful data. Vaughn answered what he could directly from the bill and supporting documents. Where agency expertise was better suited, he deferred to staff. Where uncertainty remained, he acknowledged it and returned to the pilot nature of the program. The legislature was not claiming to have all the answers, but it was prepared to test a structured approach rather than continue under scattered improvisation. When the hearing closed, the committee moved into executive session. Members discussed in frank but measured terms the political and practical implications. Some expressed concern that the state was stepping further into a federal arena. Others worried about setting expectations among ranchers that the state might not be able to sustain after the pilot ended. But a majority saw the pilot as a reasonable, time-bounded attempt to improve a situation that was already costing the state money and goodwill. No amendments were adopted. The committee voted to send House Bill 147 to the House floor with a recommendation that it do pass. On the day of the floor vote, the bill appeared on the calendar among a mixed list of measures, some minor, some sweeping. Vaughn delivered a brief sponsor's explanation when recognized, this time pitched to the full House. He focused on the balance the bill sought, protecting a recovering species while supporting the people asked to live alongside it, spending a measured amount now to reduce higher costs later, and insisting on data transparency for all. Questions came from both predictable and less predictable corners. A representative from a coal-heavy district asked whether the pilot might encourage similar programs for other species. Another member with strong conservation backing asked whether there were enough safeguards against misuse of grant funds. A rural member wanted reassurance that the pilot would not preclude lethal control in situations where human life or safety was at risk. Vaughn answered with the same steady tone he had used in committee, pointing them back to the text of the bill and the realities on the ground. He emphasized that the pilot did not change lethal authority frameworks. It added tools and structure rather than tearing down existing guardrails. The roll call was recorded electronically, each member's vote lighting the board. The green lights outpaced the red by a margin that even veteran observers would later describe as solid for a wildlife bill. When the final tally was read, and Speaker Mamliero declared that House Bill 147 had passed the House, Vaughn allowed himself a small breath he had not realized he had been holding. The bill had cleared its first chamber. It still had another chamber and a governor to go. In the Senate, the bill needed a new shepherd. Senator Lucas Pankratz, with standing on the Agriculture and Public Lands Committee and a reputation for thoughtful work on rural issues, agreed to carry House Bill 147. Vaughn provided him with the same binder and summary he had used in House Agriculture, working through the sections until he was confident his counterpart could explain the pilot cleanly and answer basic questions. He understood that in the upper chamber, where time and patience could be even more limited, clarity was currency. The Senate Agriculture Committee, under the steady gavel of Chair Senator Coraline Wigglesworth, scheduled a hearing. Testimony felt familiar but compressed. Senators, having watched the House debate, had less appetite for rehashing every point. They focused instead on fiscal details and legal guardrails. The Attorney General's office had submitted a brief memo prepared by Assistant Attorney General Darius Quan Lee, indicating that, as drafted, the pilot did not intrude on federal prerogatives and appeared consistent with the state's current responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act. One senator floated a proposed amendment to narrow the pilot area, but it did not advance out of committee, in part because altering the geography at that stage would have required further consultation with agencies and stakeholders. The committee advanced the bill to the Senate floor without amendment. The floor debate was, by legislative standards, subdued. Senator Pankratz summarized the pilot, emphasizing its time limit and evaluation requirements. A small number of senators registered philosophical concerns about ever-expanding state involvement in grizzly management. A larger number pointed out that depredation compensation was already being paid, The pilot aimed to reduce those costs by investing in prevention and targeted capacity. The vote cleared the threshold comfortably. House Bill 147 had now passed both chambers in the same form in which it had left the LSO. The final step belonged to the executive branch. 2 days later, Vaughn stood in the governor's ceremonial office, a room lined with historic paintings and heavy wood. The central artwork, an elk captured mid-stride on a snowy ridge, looked down on a small gathering of staff, reporters, and the bill's key proponents. Governor Sullivan Toth signed his name to the bill with deliberate strokes, using the kind of ceremonial pen that would later be distributed as mementos. He spoke briefly about the importance of addressing conflicts where people and wildlife overlapped, about Wyoming's long history of managing its land and animals with a combination of pragmatism and respect, and about the value of testing new approaches in a measured way before scaling them. He acknowledged Vaughn by name as the bill's sponsor and noted that the representative's work had already begun to attract attention beyond his own committee and district. Staffers and observers, he remarked, were starting to mention him by name in conversations about the young representative who was actually getting things done. The Bighorn Grizzly Coexistence Pilot Act became law that day, stamped, numbered, and logged in the session laws. Vaughn left the room with a copy bearing the governor's signature in his hands, the ink still drying, and with the quiet understanding that policy success was not measured in ceremonial photographs, but in whether, years from now, there would be fewer dead calves, fewer dead bears, and fewer screaming meetings. The rest of Vaughn's first year in the legislature passed in the blur that afflicts every freshman who takes the job seriously. He spent long days in committee hearings on topics far removed from grizzlies, water rights, state land leases, rural broadband, and mundane but essential agency rule reviews. He learned the rhythms of floor sessions under Speaker Liero, when to press his request to speak button and when to let more senior members carry the debate. He made a habit of sitting with older legislators from both his own party and the opposition in the cafeteria, and asking, without ego, how they approached particular procedural knots. He discovered the quiet power of relationships with committee clerks like Maylin Pei, LSO analysts such as Marshall Truitt, and agency liaisons. A question answered in a hallway by a staffer about how a particular statute was being interpreted on the ground could sometimes matter more than a thunderous floor speech. His work on House Bill 147 did not pigeonhole him as a wildlife specialist in the eyes of colleagues so much as it branded him as someone who approached problems with thoroughness and a bias toward balanced solutions. County commissioners from around the state began to call or pull him aside when other issues with similar dynamics arose. Revenue volatility, rural service delivery, and the constant tension between local control and state frameworks. Secretary of State, however, was not a phrase that appeared in his internal monologue. To him, the office conjured images of paperwork and process, elections, business filings, notary commissions, and administrative rules. He saw its occupant occasionally at ceremonial events, standing near the governor and other statewide officials, but he did not imagine himself there. His own self-conception still lived squarely in the legislative world of committees, coalitions, and long days under the dome. Then the incumbent secretary abruptly announced an early retirement, citing health reasons and a desire to step away before the next election cycle. Under Wyoming law, the governor was obligated to appoint a replacement to serve the remainder of the term after soliciting recommendations from the departing secretary's party. Within days, Vaughn's phone began to light up. County party chairs called to ask whether he had considered allowing his name to be placed on the short list. Senior legislators from his own side reached out to suggest that his combination of even temperament, respect for process, and familiarity with county government made him a natural fit for an office responsible for elections administration and business services. A county clerk he had worked closely with as a commissioner sent a message urging him to think seriously about what the job could mean for local governments that depended on clear, reliable direction from the state. His first reaction was a quiet refusal. He felt barely settled in his legislative seat. He enjoyed the committee work, the give and take of policy, the sense of representing a slice of Wyoming on the House floor. The Secretary of State's office felt distant, more administrative than substantive, a place where one oversaw machinery rather than shaped policy. Yet, as he sat through long rules hearings and floor votes in the weeks that followed, the idea began to change shape. He thought about the calls he had fielded from county clerks regarding election security, ballot access in remote areas, and the strain of implementing new requirements with limited staff. He remembered the frustrations he had experienced as a county commissioner when state-level processes for business filings and public records felt opaque or slow. He realized that in a state where trust in institutions could not be taken for granted, the office responsible for certifying elections and keeping the engine of public records running was, in its own way, one of the most consequential. Responsibility, in his mind, often lived in the unglamorous corners. By the time an invitation came from the governor's staff, specifically from senior policy advisor Talon Banky, asking him to stop by for a conversation about the vacancy, his initial refusal had shifted to curiosity tinged with resolve. He still did not think of himself as someone reaching for higher office. He thought of himself as someone being asked whether he was willing to take responsibility for another piece of the state's architecture. The appointment process moved with the brisk deliberation that vacancies sometimes forced. Party officials submitted a list of recommended candidates to the governor, as required. The governor's legal and policy staff, with Talon Banky at the center of the vetting effort, conducted quiet background reviews, talking to county clerks, legislators, and agency heads about each person's temperament and track record. They looked for patterns in how candidates had handled conflict, whether they respected process, and whether they understood the difference between managing an office and using it as a political springboard. When Vaughn sat down in the governor's inner office, he did not arrive with a rehearsed pitch. He came prepared instead to explain how he thought about institutions. He described his time as a county commissioner, wrestling with budget volatility and building stabilization mechanisms that kept essential services intact. He talked about his first year in the House, where he had learned to translate local problems into statewide frameworks. He acknowledged openly that he had not envisioned himself as Secretary of State, but that the more he had thought about the office's responsibilities, overseeing elections, business filings, and key administrative functions, the more he saw it as a place where quiet, careful work could have an outsized impact. He stressed that, if appointed, he would treat the office as a steward's role rather than a partisan weapon. The integrity of elections, the clarity of business records, and the predictability of administrative processes, in his mind, were not ideological prizes. They were the rails on which everything else in state government ran. The governor listened, weighed, and then, after the necessary internal and external consultations, announced his choice. Under state law, the appointment required legislative confirmation. Governor's legal counsel, Sabrina Poindexter, prepared the formal appointment instruments, coordinated with the Legislative Service Office on notice and scheduling, and ensured that the confirmation hearing followed the established statutory script. A joint committee convened a hearing during which members from both chambers asked Vaughn pointed questions about his views on election security, access, and the appropriate relationship between the Secretary of State's office and county clerks. They probed his commitment to following statutory mandates, even when they might conflict with partisan convenience. They asked how he would balance the internal management of a mid-sized constitutional office with the outward-facing responsibilities of serving as one of the state's chief public officers. Vaughn answered as he always tried to, by anchoring his responses in concrete procedures rather than slogans. He described how he would approach staffing, how he would prioritize clear communication with county officials, and how he would handle disagreements over interpretations of the law by seeking, where necessary, guidance from the courts rather than improvising. The committee recommended confirmation. The full legislature voted to approve the appointment. In due course, he took a new oath, this time as Wyoming's Secretary of State. The setting was different from his first swearing in as a representative, fewer people, less ceremony, but the words carried a weight that landed differently now that he had spent time inside the machine he was promising to help run. He moved his working life from his house desk to an office on the first floor of the Hirschler Building East. The space was larger than any he had occupied before, with windows that looked out toward the Capitol dome he had spent the past year serving under. Files and systems replaced bill binders as his daily companions. Instead of whipping votes on a wildlife bill, he now found himself reviewing election procedures, business registration backlogs, and staffing charts, guided in those first weeks by Chief Deputy Gideon Merriweather, whose warm, eccentric patience helped translate years of institutional memory into a daily operating manual. He had not asked for the promotion, but once it arrived, he saw it as another chance to do what he had always tried to do: make the complex systems other people depended on a little more stable, a little more transparent, and a little more fair. If Grizzlies had taught him anything, it was that good intentions were not enough. Procedure mattered, records mattered, and clear frameworks mattered. He intended to bring that same mindset to the machinery of ballots, corporations, and public records, with the dome now just outside his window instead of above his head.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Bye-bye.